Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Allison Gibbs, and I'm here with my co-author, Natalie Sweet. We're from Canadian Discovery and happy to be opening this session today focused on hydrodynamics. Here's our standard legal disclaimer, which I'll leave to you to read at your own risk, and start with an overview of some of the topics we plan to touch on today. We'll start with discussing a bit about the current state of CCS in Alberta, including touching on the Quest project and its target, the basal Cambrian sand, as well as what's been going on recently with the application process for carbon sequestration rates in Alberta. From there, we'll move on to targets other than the basal Cambrian sand and the integrated geological and hydrodynamics work needed to evaluate a storage target. We'll discuss some of the challenges we encounter as we take a deeper dive into old well data from deep saline aquifers, and my co-author, Natalie Sweet, will guide us through extracting as much value as we can from these data sets. Finally, I'll shift gears to focus more on hydrodynamics, with a discussion about pressure, temperature, and CO2 density, as well as some of the impacts of fluid dynamics on storage capacity and efficiency, before tying things up with closing thoughts. Starting in December of 2021, the Government of Alberta began taking proposals for projects focused on the permanent disposal of carbon dioxide into deep saline aquifers that have no associated hydrocarbon recovery. The results of the first request in the industrial heartland, shown in blue on the map, were released at the end of March and resulted in 6 proposals chosen to proceed to the next evaluation stage for access to pore space. Since the basal Cambrian sand, which is targeted by Quest, is pretty extensive through this region, we suspect that quite a few projects in this area will be targeting that sand as well. So what makes the BCS so attractive? Well, its 30 to 40 meter thick zone of 16 to 20% porosity offers good storage capacity. Its permeability from 300 millidarcies to over a darcy provides high injectivity, and several seals exist above it to ensure containment, including the Lotsburg salts, the Devonian basal red beds, and the Middle Cambrian shale, all indicated on this map on the right. A second round of proposals that closed at the beginning of May will be targeting the remainder of Alberta, like where all these lower emitters are. Through here, the BCS thins, decreases in quality, and eventually pinches out, so other deep saline aquifers need to be examined for their carbon storage potential. These aquifers, often tested as early as the 1950s and 1960s in search of hydrocarbons, are now coming back full circle as a potential destination for sequestration. So let's go through the main components of a subsurface evaluation and some of the high-level screening criteria that is used when evaluating these targets. The main components of a subsurface evaluation include reconnaissance mapping to identify prospective zones, determining their potential storage capacity and ability for sustained injectivity of CO2, mapping of seal quality, determining any containment risk, and understanding the potential for unintended consequences such as CO2 leakage through legacy wellbores, and the design and implementation of a monitoring program to verify and secure containment and conformance. This slide outlines some high-level screening criteria for CO2 storage in aquifers. The low well density is one of the main benefits of targeting these aquifers. Depleted oil and gas pools present another option for storage, an option that provides less uncertainty in terms of capacity and injectivity, but their risk lies in legacy wellbores, where there's a potential for leakage of CO2. For aquifers, there's still risk. It simply lies elsewhere. It lies in the lack of well control in the aquifer and using the limited well control to determine the reservoir characteristics using a pretty vintage data set. If one is looking to inject large volumes of CO2, getting this right can be pretty important. I'll attempt to clarify this using the porosity versus permeability plot from Quest on the right. While the porosity and permeability of Quest is shown by the green arrow, the minimum criteria for this chart is shown by the orange arrow. As Richard Baker will discuss in his presentation later in this session, the difference in injectivity between a reservoir averaging hundreds of millidarcies of permeability versus one averaging tens of millidarcies can have some pretty significant impacts on the project economics. This is just something to keep in mind as we go through a sample project evaluation and consider our data distribution and the amount of uncertainty involved early in the assessment of a project. So, where do we start when doing a subsurface evaluation? The first stage is to do a high-level look at the geology and hydrodynamics of the aquifers present within the area of interest prior to doing a more detailed evaluation. There's been a lot of good regional work done out there that can help identify aquifer zones that could be prospective and require more work, including CDL's Hydrogeological Atlas, regional AER and AGS studies, and early papers in carbon storage by trailblazers such as Stéphane Bachut. I think they're great for setting the stage for any project and providing big picture and general patterns. In my experience, though, the subsurface is always way more complex than it first seems. It's important to start big, look at the regional systems, and then do a deep dive into all available data to investigate further. I'll provide an example of how to start taking this deep dive using an example from our deep saline aquifer study. So let's start big by looking at this schematic hydrogeological section from an AER and AGS report which covers a region between Edmonton and Grand Prairie. I like this section because it works well for highlighting the main aquifers and main aquitards in the area. The main aquitards include the Major Lake, Duvernay, and Ireton below, and the Colorado Group shales above, which provide the final seal to protect shallow aquifers from any potential leaks from CO2 storage projects below. In terms of aquifers, there are many showing up in this section, but I'd like to draw your attention to the Cambrian system aquifer at the base, which includes the basal Cambrian sand. While this appears to be one big system, geologically it actually appears to be quite compartmentalized. It's made up of several smaller aquifers separated by shales, the most extensive of which is the BCS at the base, as shown in this section here on the right. The good news from a carbon storage perspective is that this provides several stratigraphic traps for us to consider to help us in our quest to safely store CO2. The vertical lines shown within the aquifer are the head values, which are calculated from pressure tests within the aquifers and represent the energy and general flow direction within the system as a whole. In general, it's up-dip toward the northeast. Since the system has equilibrated over geologic time, the pressures line up along similar headlines on a regional pressure versus elevation plot. However, when the geologic picture and the presence of shales are considered, each aquifer is likely compartmentalized to the extent that we expect a pressure response on engineering or project timescales to remain within a smaller aquifer, and each of these should be considered as its own system from a carbon storage perspective. As a result, a detailed geologic evaluation of each smaller aquifer is required to better determine its individual extent and potential storage capacity. Let's pick one of these aquifers to do just that. The Eldon, for example, which is here in the Cambrian above the basal Cambrian sand. The Eldon sand is shown on this map on the left. That grid in the background is townships. The aquifer covers an area of about 20,000 kilometers, so over 20 times the size of Calgary. Within that area, we have 70 well penetrations with logs, which is about one well for every 2 to 3 townships. The distribution allows us to get a relatively good idea of the sand extent and regional structure, albeit with a fair bit of uncertainty, particularly in areas where we have large data gaps that are about the size of the city of Calgary. If we look at the vintage of the wells, the majority of the wells we are working with were drilled before 1970, so before neutron density logs were commonly used. I'm going to turn things over to my co-author, Natalie, at this point, who is young but happens to be well-versed in getting useful information from the very old, to discuss what kind of information we can get out of these older logs and core data, and how we can use this information to make estimates and assumptions regarding the reservoir geometry and continuity.
Thanks, Allison. I am by no means young, but younger than some of the logs that we have to use. Since there are relatively few wells drilled through the entire Cambrian section in Alberta, there is a need to use every scrap of data available. So, how do you get useful information from very old logs? Here's a log suite from a 1956 well showing a caliper, SP, microlog, and resistivity log. None of these logs will give a quantitative value, but they do give very good information on qualitative values of porosity and permeability. The first log on the left shows a caliper log which responds to mudcake invasion and the resulting narrowing of the wellbore and is highlighted in yellow. The SP, or spontaneous potential log, is responding to the electrochemical difference between the saline water in the porous and permeable zone and the mud filtrate, and will move to the left, showing porosity and permeability. The microlog is a log that's measuring the difference between the invaded zone and the mud filtrate. The curve separation seen indicates the presence of mudcake buildup in the permeable zone. The final log, shown on the right, is the resistivity log, and although the resolution is often poor, it is still responding to the presence of saline formation water. All of these logs are responding to a porous and permeable zone. This zone was also drill stem tested and recovered over 800 meters of salt water, which indicates good permeability and porosity. This data can be used to provide net reservoir thickness, even if you can't give it an actual porosity value or a permeability value. You can sure use this information. So how do we get more information from these old wells? Well, you need to look at core, and if available, or drill cuttings to determine lithology, visual estimates of porosity and permeability if no core measurements are available. Core and cuttings will always provide information on lithology, mineralogy, and even depositional environment. In the example shown, the thin section shows a lower Paleozoic carbonate and is a fabric destructive dolostone with very good porosity and permeability. The thin section was cut from a core that is interpreted to have been deposited in a restricted carbonate complex, providing some insight, for example, on direction of deposition of facies, stackability of the reservoir, lateral predictability, which all provide information to define the storage complex. This data also increases reservoir knowledge and can predict things like potential chemical interactions with the CO2, if you have a carbonate or a sandstone, pore space pathways, the connectivity, permeability of how is that CO2 going to move through the pore space, and any vertical and lateral changes, and providing insight to storage capacity. Understanding the potential scale of the storage complex can be ascertained by understanding the overall depositional systems in the lower Paleozoic. The Cambrian large-scale sequences were aerially extensive and had broad depositional belts. The sandstones of the Eldon Formation, as an example, can be mapped for over 90 kilometers wide and appear to be quite continuous. Middle Devonian shallow water carbonates are laterally extensive in southern Alberta. For reference, the Bahama Bank shallow carbonate complex shown is 450 kilometers long and 150 kilometers wide. The large-scale depositional environments of various systems provides insight as to areal extent, potential vertical and lateral heterogeneity, and overall potential storage size, which helps define and delineate potential storage zones for your CCUS projects. The next step in the workflow is calculating the pore volume of the zone identified. Allison will now talk about these next steps in the outlined workflow.
Thanks, Natalie. All right, now that we've looked at some additional logs, core, and cuttings, and are feeling fairly comfortable with our depositional environment and the potential lateral continuity, in the interest of time, let's fast forward a bit and say we've pulled all our information together and mapped out our potential net porous sand. We've also estimated our average porosity based on the available porosity logs and core. The next step in the workflow would be the calculation of the pore volume of the zone identified. From here, we can estimate what the pore volume looks like on a township-by-township basis within the aquifer. On this map on the right, the greens, yellows, and reds indicate the areas of highest potential pore volume. If we're trying to plan a project, here for example, we can get a basic idea of where the best reservoir trends might be. We also know that CO2 is less dense than aquifer brine and will likely travel to the top of the aquifer and up dip. So that starts to give us an idea of where the plume might travel over time. But in order to start determining a storage capacity, we need to get a better idea of the reservoir conditions and estimate the CO2 density at those conditions. While the pressure and temperature data can be limited within these aquifers themselves, generally we can use the measured temperature from multiple formations to map out the regional geothermal gradients, as those gradients tend to vary only slightly with depth between rock types. We can then use this information to estimate the temperature at formation depth. Pressure gradients, however, are a little more tricky as pressures need time to build up, and the pressure gradients can vary a lot between formations. The 4 drill stem tests in the Eldon were performed between 1955 and 1965, which, as we've seen previously, often results in data availability issues. This report example was actually taken from another formation in the Cambrian in the 1960s, as I was unable to get the original reports for these Eldon tests. These tests have good water recovery, but sometimes only a water recovery, and often have a water chemistry which is helpful for determining the brine density. A couple have pressures, and one has detailed shut-in data, allowing us to extrapolate a formation pressure and determine a pressure depth ratio. The pressure depth ratio lines up within the expected range of 10 kPa per meter in the west and 9 kPa per meter in the east that was observed for the rest of the Cambrian tests that were shown on the earlier pressure versus elevation graph. None of these tests had enough data to determine a permeability, which requires the drill pipe length, collar length, and IDs, as this information generally wasn't captured in reports before the 1970s. So using the pressure depth ratio, the temperature gradient, and the TOPS data we have, we're able to confirm that the CO2 we will be storing is at supercritical, meaning that the carbon dioxide has a density of a liquid but viscosity of a gas, which is ideal because the storage volume required is substantially less. We are also able to estimate the CO2 density, which allows us to calculate a theoretical storage capacity for that pore volume data that we showed earlier. Theoretical storage capacity, however, assumes that the pore volume will be occupied entirely by CO2, which we know is not the case since the pore space is already occupied by water. As a result, a storage efficiency factor, or E-saline, is often introduced into static storage capacity calculations, which accounts for the presence of both water and CO2 in the aquifer. It's a function of reservoir and fluid properties and dynamics, including the geometry of the trap, gravity segregation, heterogeneity, permeability distribution, and pressure. Xiao Jun will be going into detail about the critical parameters of static and dynamic processes of CO2 storage capacities in AGAT's talk in this session, so luckily I don't need to go into much detail here. Suffice to say that there are a wide range of E-saline numbers available in literature, some very small, which better reflect the larger scale long-term storage, and some very large, which better represent local plume migration on a shorter time scale. Whatever is used really needs to be tested and verified by simulation, which is able to capture these dynamic aspects of plume migration. Before we tie things up, I just want to say a few words about permeability. While permeability is not directly part of storage capacity calculation, it has an impact on the accessibility of the porosity to the injected CO2 and on maintaining the required injection rate for the project lifespan. Higher permeability rock allows fluids to migrate more easily through better connected pores away from the injection well, which subsequently magnifies the capacity and efficiency of the aquifer to store CO2. The KH is proportional to the injectivity, which is defined as the ratio of the injection rate to the pressure change between the well and the storage zone. Luckily, we have a core in the Eldon formation that can help give us some insights into what injectivity might look like for an Eldon project as compared to the Quest project. In the plot on the right, a group from Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus looked at field data from CCS projects worldwide in order to identify a correlation between injectivity and KH to gain a basic idea of potential reservoir performance prior to more time-intensive and expensive steps like detailed simulation runs and drilling an appraisal well. Our minimum screening criteria at 20 meters of 20 millidarcy rock sits about here on the left, while Quest at 35 to 40 meters of 600 millidarcy reservoir sits about here on the right. The Eldon location we previously identified, let's say 25 meters of 100 millidarcy reservoir, would sit somewhere in the middle. Keeping in mind, we are using averages. The best reservoir in the Eldon would sit significantly higher than the solid arrow, as would the best reservoir at Quest. But our project requirements, whether 1 megaton per year or hundreds of kilotons per year, will dictate where we need to be on the chart, so it's really about balancing needs and expectations. It doesn't mean that a 1 megaton per year project is impossible in the Eldon. It just means that there's a higher risk of not being able to meet targets, and that many wells or multiple targets may be necessary to inject the volumes needed, which will affect project's economics. Stay tuned to hear more about this topic in Richard and Alex's talk on the value of information from existing wells in CCUS. So with that, let's quickly tie things up with a review of some of the points we covered. An integrated geological and hydrogeological subsurface evaluation is needed for CCS projects. Deep saline aquifers are considered a favorable target due to their low well density. The risk in saline aquifers lies in limited data availability and the vintage of the data. As a result, it's very important to extract as much information as possible from all available datasets, including old logs and DSTs. Storage capacity can be estimated using pore volume and CO2 density, but effective storage capacity depends on many factors and should be supported by simulation. Injectivity can be estimated from KH, and CCS projects involve a lot of risk and uncertainty, which won't be minimized until an appraisal well is drilled and the targets are better characterized. Thank you. One last thing, I'd like to encourage you to visit our virtual booth and invite you to watch some other great talks from my colleagues at Canadian Discovery. I'd like to thank Candace Keeler and Lena Hage for their help with the graphics on this talk, as well as everyone listed here for their contributions. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us here at Canadian Discovery, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.